She knocked only to survive. He opened the door just to pass another lonely night in silence. But fate had other plans that would change everything. The year was 1885, and the Oregon Territory was carved from wilderness by men who knew how to swing an axe and women who knew how to endure. In the heart of the Cascade Mountains, where towering Douglas firs stretched toward heaven and the air smelled of sawdust and determination, there lived a man who had forgotten what it meant to belong to something bigger than himself. Jeremiah Bear Sullivan stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown pine and hands that could split wood like kindling. His beard was dark as forest shadows, streaked with premature silver that spoke of winters spent alone in cabins, too quiet for comfort. For 8 years, he'd supervised Sullivan's Mill, a lumber operation so remote that mail came twice a month and visitors came never. Bear had earned his nickname not just for his size, but for his solitary nature. Like the great brown bears that roam these mountains, he was respected, feared, and left alone. The lumber crew knew better than to invite him for drinks after a hard day's work. They'd seen the way his eyes went distant when conversation turned to families back home, wives waiting in warm kitchens, children who counted the days until Daddy returned from the logging camps. Nobody knew why Jeremiah Sullivan had chosen exile over companionship. Some whispered about a woman back east who'd broken his heart. Others figured he'd done something terrible enough to make solitude seem like penance. The truth was simpler and sadder. Bear Sullivan had simply forgotten how to let people close without losing them. But on this particular November evening, as the first snow of winter began to dust the mountain peaks and the lumber mill fell silent for another day, fate was preparing to teach him that some gifts come disguised as desperate knocks on cabin doors. Rebecca Morrison stood on that same mountainside, clutching the hands of 3 children whose trust in her was the only thing keeping her from falling to her knees in despair. She had no way of knowing that her next decision would not only save her family's lives, but heal a broken man's heart in ways that 8 years of solitude never could. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the sound of knuckles against wood and a voice whispering the most powerful prayer ever spoken. Please help us. The wind screamed down from Mount Hood like a living thing, hungry and cruel, biting through every layer of wool and determination Rebecca Morrison could wrap around herself and her children. Snow fell sideways now, each flake a tiny knife cutting through the dying light of day. She pulled 12-year-old Lucy closer to her side, while 10-year-old Ben tried to be brave beside them, his small jaw clenched against the cold that made his breath come in sharp white puffs. 6-year-old Tommy had stopped complaining about the cold an hour ago, which scared Rebecca more than his earlier tears. "Mama," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I can't feel my feet anymore." Rebecca's heart clenched, but she forced strength into her voice. "Just a little farther, sweetheart. I promise." But the truth was, Rebecca Morrison didn't know if there was anywhere farther to go. They'd been walking for 2 days since the wagon wheel had cracked beyond repair 20 miles down the mountain. Her husband James had been dead 3 months now, crushed by a falling tree at another lumber camp, leaving her with 3 children, $17, and a promise that there would be work for widow women at Sullivan's Mill if she could just get there. Now, with night falling and the temperature dropping toward deadly, that promise felt as fragile as the ice forming on Tommy's eyelashes. Then she saw it, a golden square of light cutting through the swirling snow like hope made visible. A cabin window, warm and glowing, maybe 200 yards ahead through the pine trees. "There," she breathed, pointing with a hand so numb she could barely move her fingers. "There's a light?" Ben straightened beside her, squinting through the snow. "Is it the mill, Mama?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted, "but it's shelter." They stumbled through the snow together, Rebecca half carrying Tommy while Lucy and Ben held onto her skirt. The cabin grew larger as they approached, well-built, solid, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and several windows glowing with firelight. It looked like sanctuary. Rebecca's knocking hand shook as she raised it to the heavy wooden door. Behind that door could be salvation or danger, kindness or cruelty. She had no choice but to find out. Her first knock was weak, barely audible over the wind. Nothing. Her second was stronger, more desperate. Still nothing. On the third knock, she pounded with her fist, putting all her fear and hope into the sound. Please, she called out, her voice cracking with cold and desperation. Please, we have children. Footsteps, heavy, measured, like a man not used to unexpected visitors. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the forest. The man who filled the doorway was enormous, not fat, but built like the mountains themselves, solid and unmoving. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, his beard full and untrimmed. But it was his eyes that caught Rebecca's attention. They were gray as storm clouds and held the kind of wariness that came from disappointment, repeated too many times to count. Those eyes took in the scene before him. A woman barely 30 with brown hair escaping from beneath a wool cap, her face red with cold and exhaustion, clutching 3 children who swayed on their feet like saplings in a strong wind. For a moment that felt like eternity, nobody spoke. Rebecca saw the man's gaze move from her face to Lucy's pale cheeks, to Ben's chattering teeth, to little Tommy's blue lips. Something shifted in those gray eyes. "Get inside," he said, his voice like gravel ground, smoothed by years of use. "All of you. Now." Rebecca didn't hesitate. She pushed the children ahead of her into the blessed warmth of the cabin, following quickly as the man shut the door against the screaming wind. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and cast dancing shadows across rough-hewn furniture that looked handmade but well-crafted. The air smelled of pine smoke, coffee, and something else. Loneliness, maybe, the particular scent of a place where one person had lived alone for too long. "Sit," the man commanded, pointing toward chairs arranged near the fire. "Get warm." Rebecca helped the children out of their wet coats and boots, her hands shaking as feeling began to return to her fingers. The man moved with surprising grace for his size, pulling blankets from a chest and wrapping them around each child without a word. He returned moments later with steaming mugs of coffee for Rebecca and warm milk for the children. "Drink," he said simply. Rebecca cradled the mug in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her bones. The children huddled close to the fire, their faces slowly returning to normal color. Tommy had stopped shivering, which was the best thing Rebecca had seen in days. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm Rebecca Morrison. These are my children, Lucy, Ben, and Tommy." The man nodded once, economically. "Jeremiah Sullivan. Folks call me Bear." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Sullivan? As in Sullivan's Mill?" "That's right." Hope flared in her chest like the flames in his fireplace. "I was trying to reach the mill. They told me in Oregon City that there might be work for a widow woman." Bear studied her face in the firelight. "You James Morrison's widow?" Rebecca's breath caught. "You knew James?" "Worked with him 2 seasons back, before he moved on to the Hartwell operation." Bear's expression darkened. "Heard what happened. Tree fell wrong. Good man, your husband. Sorry for your loss." Tears stung Rebecca's eyes. It had been months since someone had spoken James's name with respect instead of pity. "Thank you. He spoke of you, actually. Said you were the best foreman in the territory." Bear made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so rough around the edges. "Reckon that depends on who you ask." As the children gradually warmed up and their exhaustion began to show, Bear moved with quiet efficiency. He pulled cushions from a storage chest, arranging a makeshift bed near the fire. Without being asked, Lucy helped tuck Tommy into the blankets while Ben tried to hide his own yawns. "They can sleep here tonight," Bear said to Rebecca. "Warmest spot in the cabin." "I can't ask you to." "Ain't asking, telling." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Storm's getting worse. Nobody travels in weather like this." Rebecca looked toward the window, where snow was building up against the glass like nature's own wall. She thought of the $20 gold piece sewn into her coat lining, all the money she had left in the world, and knew he was right. "What about the mill?" she asked. "Is there really work?" Bear poured himself coffee from a pot on the stove, considering her question. "Might be. Marcus Blackthorne runs the business side these days. I handle the men in the cutting. Been short-handed since the last crew finished their contracts." "What kind of work?" "Cooking, mostly. Keeping the bunkhouse clean, mending clothes. Some of the men have been eating their own cooking for 2 months now." Bear's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. They'd pay good money for a woman who knows her way around a kitchen. Rebecca felt a surge of hope. She could cook, she could clean and mend, and do whatever needed doing to keep her children fed and housed. Would you, would you speak for me? To Mr. Blackthorne? Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if the dark liquid might hold answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. When he looked up, his gray eyes held something new. Not warmth exactly, but not the cold distance she'd first seen there either. "I'll speak for you," he said simply. "James was a good man. His family deserves better than what you've been handed." As the wind continued to howl outside and the fire settled into steady, comforting crackles, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. She had no way of knowing that the man sitting across from her, staring into flames that reflected years of solitude in his gray eyes, was thinking the same thing for the first time in 8 long years. Dawn came pale and cold, filtered through windows frosted with ice and painted with snow. Rebecca woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood and the low murmur of children's voices. She found Lucy, Ben, and Tommy sitting at Bear's kitchen table, eating what appeared to be the best breakfast they'd had in weeks. "Mama!" Tommy called out happily, his face bright with the resilience that only children possessed. "Mr. Bear made pancakes, real ones, with syrup." Bear stood at the stove, spatula in his massive hand, looking almost comically domestic. He glanced over his shoulder as Rebecca entered the kitchen. "Coffee's hot," he said simply. Rebecca poured herself a cup and studied the man who had taken in her family without question. In daylight, she could see details that the firelight had hidden. The careful way he moved despite his size, the precision with which he'd arranged everything in his cabin, the small touches that spoke of a man who took pride in his solitary life, but perhaps missed having someone to share it with. "Eat," Bear said, sliding a plate of pancakes toward her. "Going to be a long day." "Are we going to the mill today?" Lucy asked, her 12-year-old pragmatism already at work. "Will there really be a job for Mama?" Bear flipped another pancake before answering. "We'll see what Blackthorne says, but I suspect your Mama's going to have more work than she knows what to do with." After breakfast, Bear hitched his horse to a sturdy sledge and loaded Rebecca and the children into the back, covering them with warm furs and blankets. The ride to Sullivan's Mill took 30 minutes through pine forest so thick that noon felt like twilight, down paths that Bear navigated with the confidence of a man who knew every tree and boulder. When they emerged into the clearing that housed Sullivan's Mill, Rebecca gasped. The operation was larger than she'd imagined. A massive sawmill building with steam rising from multiple chimneys, neat rows of bunkhouses, a commissary, stables, and other outbuildings. Men moved purposefully between the structures, some heading toward the forest with saws and axes, others guiding teams of oxen pulling enormous logs toward the mill. "It's like a whole town," Ben breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. 60 men work here during cutting season," Bear explained as he guided the sledge toward the largest building. "They sleep, eat, and work here for months at a time. Been managing without proper cooking or housekeeping since the last woman quit in September." The building Bear led them to was clearly the main office, well-built but utilitarian, with smoke rising from a chimney and the warm glow of lamplight in the windows. Bear knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer. The man behind the desk looked up with the irritated expression of someone interrupted during important work. Marcus Blackthorne was perhaps 50, with thinning hair slicked back with oil, and clothes that spoke of city origins rather than frontier practicality. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and they moved over Rebecca and her children with the calculating gaze of someone who saw people as numbers in a ledger. "Sullivan," Blackthorne said, leaning back in his chair. "What brings you here so early, and with visitors?" "This is Rebecca Morrison," Bear said without preamble. "James Morrison's widow, looking for work." Blackthorne's eyebrows rose. "Morrison? Yes, I remember. Unfortunate accident. Hartwell mentioned it in his correspondence." His gaze moved over Rebecca again, lingering on her worn clothes and the way she stood protectively in front of her children. "What sort of work did you have in mind, Mrs. Morrison? Cooking, cleaning, mending?" Rebecca said, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. Whatever needs doing to keep your men fed and comfortable. I see. Blackthorne stood and moved around his desk, circling Rebecca like a hawk evaluating prey. And these children? They would live here as well? Yes, sir. They won't be any trouble. Blackthorne made a non-committal sound. Children are always trouble, Mrs. Morrison. They eat food, take up space, make noise. The men come here to work, not to play nursemaid to other people's offspring. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Bear stepped forward. His presence seemed to fill the room, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. The men have been eating burned beans and stale bread for 2 months, Blackthorne. Last week, 3 of them got sick from spoiled meat because nobody knows how to properly store food through winter. You're losing money every day. You don't have proper cooking and housekeeping. Blackthorne's pale eyes flicked between Bear and Rebecca. And you think Mrs. Morrison here is the solution to our problems? I think she's a woman who knows how to work hard and keep house properly. I think she's got 3 children who'll help with chores and earn their keep. And I think you'd be a fool to let her walk away. The office fell silent except for the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Rebecca held her breath, acutely aware that her family's future hung in the balance of whatever calculation was taking place behind Marcus Blackthorne's cold blue eyes. Finally, Blackthorne returned to his chair. Very well. I'll offer you a trial period, Mrs. Morrison. 1 month, $30 plus room and board for you and the children. If the men are satisfied with your cooking and the housekeeping improves, we'll discuss a permanent arrangement. $30 was less than Rebecca had hoped for, but it was steady money and a roof over their heads. I accept, she said quickly. Excellent. Blackthorne made a note in a ledger. Sullivan will show you to your quarters. You'll start with breakfast tomorrow morning. He looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I do hope you understand, Mrs. Morrison, that this is a business operation. Sentiment has no place here. You'll succeed based on your work, nothing more. As they left the office, Rebecca felt both relief and unease. She had the job she desperately needed, but something about Marcus Blackthorne made her skin crawl. The way he'd looked at her, the calculation in his voice, it reminded her of men who saw women as property rather than people. Bear led them toward a small cabin set apart from the main bunkhouses. This was the last cook's place, he explained, opening the door. Basic, but it's got a good stove and room for all of you. The cabin was indeed basic. 2 rooms, a kitchen area with a large cast-iron stove, and simple furniture that had seen better days. But it was clean and warm, with windows that looked out toward the forest and a small porch where children could play. It's perfect, Rebecca said, and meant it. After sleeping in a wagon for 2 weeks and spending last night on Bear's floor, this little cabin felt like a mansion. Commissary's next door, Bear continued. That's where you'll do most of the cooking. Feed 60 men 3 times a day during full season. Right now, we're down to about 40, but that's still a lot of mouths. Rebecca walked through the cabin, already mentally arranging furniture and planning meals. The children explored their new home with the adaptability of youth, Ben immediately claiming the small loft space, while Lucy helped Tommy understand that this was their new home. Bear, Rebecca said quietly as the children played in the next room. Thank you for speaking for me, for bringing us here. I won't forget it. Bear nodded uncomfortably, as if kindness were something he wasn't used to acknowledging. James was a good man, he said simply. This is what he would have wanted. As Bear prepared to leave, Tommy ran over and tugged on his coat. Mr. Bear, will you come see us again? Bear looked down at the 6-year-old's hopeful face, and for a moment, his expression softened completely. I might could do that, he said gravely, if your mama says it's all right. That evening, as Rebecca unpacked their few belongings and prepared for her first day of work, she found herself thinking about the contradiction that was Jeremiah Sullivan. He was a man who lived alone by choice, yet he'd opened his door to strangers without hesitation. He was gruff and economical with words, yet he'd spoken for her when she needed an advocate most. She had no way of knowing that in his own cabin, Bear was having similar thoughts about the woman who'd knocked on his door during a blizzard and somehow made his too-quiet world feel alive again. Outside their respective windows, the Oregon forest settled into another cold night, holding its breath for the changes that morning would bring. The commissary kitchen at dawn was Rebecca's new battlefield, and she approached it with the determination of a general planning a campaign. 60 hungry men would expect breakfast in 2 hours, and she had no intention of disappointing them, or giving Marcus Blackthorne any reason to question his decision. Lucy stood beside her, tying an apron around her waist with the seriousness of someone far older than 12. "What do you need me to do first, Mama?" Rebecca surveyed the kitchen. Massive cast-iron stoves, enormous pots and pans, storage rooms filled with supplies. It was intimidating and exhilarating at the same time. "Help me figure out what we have to work with. Ben, you and Tommy start bringing in firewood. These stoves are going to need feeding." For the next hour, the Morrison family worked together with the efficiency born of necessity. Rebecca inventoried supplies while Lucy organized cooking utensils, and the boys kept the fires burning hot. By the time the first loggers began drifting in for breakfast, the commissary smelled of coffee, bacon, and fresh biscuits. The men who filed in were a rough bunch, bearded, weather-beaten, wearing clothes that had seen hard use in the forest. They approached the serving area with the wariness of soldiers who'd learned not to expect much from life. But when Rebecca began filling their plates with perfectly cooked eggs, crispy bacon, and biscuits that were actually light and fluffy, their expressions changed. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered one grizzled logger. "Ma'am, these biscuits are better than my own mother used to make. And this coffee doesn't taste like it was made with tree bark," added another, raising his cup in salute. Word spread quickly through the mill. By the time Bear Sullivan walked in for his breakfast, the commissary was buzzing with conversation and laughter in a way it hadn't in months. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. Rebecca moving efficiently between stove and serving area, Lucy helping dish up food with adult-like competence, Ben and Tommy charming the rough loggers with their eager questions about the work. "Morning, Bear," called out one of the men. "You taste Mrs. Morrison's cooking yet? Woman's a miracle worker." Bear approached the serving area where Rebecca stood, a slight flush of pride and exertion coloring her cheeks. "Morning," he said simply. "Smells good in here." "Thank you." Rebecca filled a plate with more food than any normal person could eat, but she'd already learned that Bear Sullivan was larger than normal in every way. "How do you like your eggs?" "However you want to make them," Bear replied, and something in his tone made Rebecca look up. Their eyes met across the serving counter, and for a moment, the noise of the commissary faded into background. "Over easy," Rebecca decided, cracking fresh eggs into the skillet. "That's how James liked them." The mention of her husband seemed to break whatever spell had been building. Bear nodded and took his plate to a table in the corner, eating alone as always. But Rebecca noticed that he stayed longer than usual, nursing his coffee while the commissary gradually emptied. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised everyone, including Rebecca herself. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, spent her mornings cooking and her afternoons planning meals, managing supplies, and teaching the children to help. Lucy proved to have a natural talent for baking, while Ben became expert at keeping the fires at exactly the right temperature. Even little Tommy contributed, charming the loggers into helping with small tasks and generally bringing life to the previously all-male environment. But it was the evenings that held the most magic. After the dinner dishes were cleared and the commissary cleaned for the next day, Rebecca would often find Bear on her small porch, whittling or simply sitting in comfortable silence. At first, these visits were brief and awkward, a man who'd forgotten how to make conversation and a woman too tired to try. But gradually, as the children grew comfortable around him and Rebecca began to trust his steady presence, the silences became less awkward and more companionable. "Tell me about James," Bear said one evening, his knife moving steadily through a piece of pine that was slowly becoming a horse for Tommy. Rebecca considered the question, surprised to find that talking about her husband didn't hurt as much as it once had. He was a good man, patient with the children, never raised his voice in anger. He had dreams of buying his own piece of land someday, maybe starting a small farm. Sounds like a man worth missing? He was. Rebecca rocked slowly in the chair Bear had repaired for her the week before. But I'm learning that missing someone doesn't mean your life has to stop. Bear looked up from his carving, studying her face in the lamplight. That's a hard lesson. The hardest, Rebecca agreed. What about you? Ever been married? Bear's hand stilled on the carving. For a moment, Rebecca thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Once, long time ago. What happened? She died. Fever took her our first winter in Oregon. Bear resumed his carving, but his movements were more deliberate now, controlled. Been 8 years now. Rebecca felt her heart clench with sympathy. I'm sorry, that must have been terrible. It was. Bear held up the carved horse, examining his work. Thought it was the end of everything good in the world. Took me a long time to learn that maybe it was just the end of one thing. Not everything. That night, after Bear had gone back to his own cabin and the children were asleep, Rebecca stood at her window looking out at the forest. For the first time since James's death, she wasn't thinking about the past or worrying about the future. She was simply present in the moment, aware of the contentment that had been growing quietly in her heart. She was building something here, not just a job or a place to live, but a life. The children were thriving, growing stronger and more confident every day. The loggers had accepted them completely, often stopping by in the evenings to teach Ben about tools or listen to Lucy read from her books. Even Marcus Blackthorne seemed satisfied with her work, though Rebecca still felt uneasy whenever he visited the commissary. But it was Bear's presence that had become the anchor of their new life. He fixed things that broke, taught Ben practical skills that every boy should know, and listened to Lucy's dreams of someday becoming a teacher. Most importantly, he treated Rebecca not as a woman to be pitied or managed, but as an equal partner in the complex task of keeping 40 men fed and happy. Neither Rebecca nor Bear spoke of the growing connection between them. It was too new, too fragile, and both had been hurt badly enough to approach love with caution. But it was there in the way Bear always seemed to appear when Rebecca needed an extra pair of hands, in the way Rebecca always saved the best portions of dinner for him, in the quiet conversations that stretched later into the evening with each passing week. The children, with the intuitive wisdom of youth, had already accepted Bear as part of their family. Tommy followed him everywhere, chattering constantly about everything and nothing. Lucy sought his opinion on her school lessons and listened seriously to his advice. Ben had begun unconsciously copying Bear's mannerisms, from the way he held his tools to the measured way he spoke. But perhaps the most telling sign of the changes taking place was something Rebecca noticed only gradually. Bear had begun to smile, not the careful, polite expressions he wore around the other men, but real smiles that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. They appeared when Tommy proudly showed off something he'd learned, when Lucy read aloud from her books, when Ben successfully completed a task Bear had taught him. And sometimes when Rebecca caught Bear looking at her across the commissary or during their evening conversations, she saw something in his gray eyes that made her heart race with possibilities she'd thought died with James. Winter was settling deeper into the mountains, but inside the little cabin and the warm commissary, spring was beginning to bloom in the most unexpected ways. The letter arrived on a gray December morning, delivered by a rider who'd fought his way through early snow to reach Sullivan's mill. Marcus Blackthorne read it twice before calling for Bear to come to his office, his pale eyes holding the satisfied gleam of a man who'd just discovered a new way to assert control. Bear arrived still wearing his work clothes, sawdust clinging to his massive shoulders, and annoyance written clearly on his face. He didn't like being pulled away from important work for Blackthorne's administrative games. "Shut the door, Sullivan," Blackthorne said without looking up from the letter. "We need to discuss Mrs. Morrison." Something in the man's tone made Bear's jaw tighten. "What about her?" Blackthorne held up the letter with theatrical flair. "It seems our dear cook has been less than honest about her circumstances. This is from my associate, Mr. Harrison, who runs the lumber operation where her husband worked." Bear remained silent, but his gray eyes had taken on the cold stillness that smart men learn to fear. "According to Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Morrison owes the company store nearly $200 for advances made to her husband before his death. Company policy is quite clear. Such debts are inherited by the surviving family members. That's got nothing to do with her work here," Bear said evenly. Blackthorne smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. Oh, but it does, Sullivan. You see, Mr. Harrison is prepared to forgive the debt entirely if Mrs. Morrison agrees to return to his operation and work it off. He has a specific position in mind for her. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dirty fire. Bear took a step forward, his presence suddenly filling the small office. What kind of position? The kind that a widow with 3 children and no money can't afford to refuse? Blackthorne leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. Harrison runs a more diverse operation than we do here. He understands that men have needs beyond just food and shelter. Bear's hands clenched into fists the size of small boulders. You're talking about turning her into a whore. I'm talking about economic reality, Blackthorne replied smoothly. The woman has debts. Harrison is offering her a way to pay them off while earning a living. It's really quite generous of him. She's got work here. Good work. Temporary work, Blackthorne corrected. Her trial period ends next week, and I've decided not to renew her contract. There have been complaints about her performance. Bear knew this was a lie. The men loved Rebecca's cooking, and the commissary had never run more efficiently. What complaints? The children are disruptive. The men are distracted by having a woman around. And frankly, Sullivan, your own behavior has become problematic. How so? Blackthorne stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered mill yard with affected casualness. You spend every evening at her cabin. The men talk, Sullivan. They wonder if you're getting special privileges that affect your judgment as a supervisor. Bear's voice dropped to a growl that seemed to rumble up from his chest. You're calling my integrity into question? I'm suggesting that your personal feelings have compromised your professional judgment. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if Mrs. Morrison accepted Harrison's generous offer and relocated to his operation. Bear stared at Blackthorne for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the kind of man he was dealing with. Not just greedy or callous, but genuinely corrupt. The sort who saw other people's desperation as opportunities for profit and control. She's not going anywhere, Bear said finally. Blackthorne turned from the window, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Sullivan. Mrs. Morrison has debts to pay and children to feed. She'll go where the work is. Then she'll stay here because she's got work here. Not after next week, she doesn't. Bear stepped closer to Blackthorne's desk, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the smaller man. You fire her, you'll have a problem with me. Blackthorne's smile widened. Are you threatening me, Sullivan? I'm telling you how things are going to be. I see. Blackthorne returned to his chair, pulling out a sheet of letterhead. Well then, let me tell you how things are really going to be. You have 2 choices, Sullivan. You can mind your own business and continue supervising my lumber operation, or you can find yourself unemployed and blacklisted throughout the territory. A man with your reputation would find it very difficult to secure employment elsewhere. Bear's eyes narrowed. What reputation? The kind that comes from a questionable past and an unfortunate tendency toward violence. Oh yes, Sullivan, I've made inquiries about you. Very interesting reading. For the first time since entering the office, Bear felt uncertainty creep into his chest. Blackthorne clearly knew something about his past. Secrets Bear had thought buried along with his wife 8 years ago. So here's what's going to happen, Blackthorne continued, his voice taking on the satisfied tone of a man holding all the cards. Mrs. Morrison's employment will be terminated at the end of the week. She'll accept Harrison's generous offer and relocate to his operation with her children. And you'll continue doing your job without interference. Everyone gets what they need, except Rebecca and her kids. Mrs. Morrison will have steady employment and the opportunity to pay off her late husband's debts. Her children will have food and shelter. Really, Sullivan, what more could a woman in her position ask for? Bear stared at Blackthorne for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. He could refuse, could fight this obvious corruption, but Blackthorne clearly held leverage that Bear didn't fully understand. And if he lost his position here, what good would he be to Rebecca and the children? I need to think about this, Bear said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. Blackthorne picked up his pen, already dismissing him. But remember, Sullivan, Harrison expects an answer by Friday. After that, his offer expires, and Mrs. Morrison will be responsible for the full debt immediately. I'm sure you understand the implications. Bear left the office with his mind churning and his heart heavy with rage and fear. He understood the implications perfectly. If Rebecca couldn't pay the debt, she could be arrested, and her children would become wards of the state, scattered to orphanages or worse. That evening, Bear sat on Rebecca's porch as usual, but his customary calm was nowhere to be found. Rebecca noticed immediately, her intuitive understanding of his moods having grown sharp over their weeks together. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down her mending to study his face. Bear was quiet for a long time, staring out at the forest while he wrestled with how much to tell her. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "Blackthorn's planning to let you go at the end of the week." Rebecca's hands stilled on her mending. "What? But the men are happy with my cooking. The commissary runs better than it has in months. This isn't about your work." Bear turned to face her, his gray eyes filled with an anger that made Rebecca's breath catch. "Your husband owed money to the company store where he worked. Blackthorn's friend wants to collect." "How much money?" $200. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. $200 might as well have been 2,000. It was more money than she could earn in a year, even with steady work. "I don't have that kind of money." "I know, that's the point." Rebecca set down her mending with hands that had begun to shake. "What does this man want from me?" Bear's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "He runs a different kind of operation than this one, the kind where women work off debts in ways that—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Understanding hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch, as if movement could help her escape the trap that was closing around her family. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "I can work double shifts, take in washing, anything." "Rebecca," Bear's voice was gentle but firm, "even if you could earn that much, Blackthorn won't let you stay here to do it. He wants you gone." "Why? What have I done to him?" Bear stood and moved beside her, his presence solid and reassuring even in the face of disaster. "You haven't done anything, but you've given me something I didn't know I needed, and he sees that as a threat to his control." Rebecca looked up at him, seeing the pain in his eyes that he was trying so hard to hide. "Bear, what aren't you telling me?" Bear was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old grief and carefully buried shame. 8 years ago, I wasn't the man I am now. I was angry, broken by losing my wife, and I made some bad choices, got into fights, drank too much, hurt people who didn't deserve it." He stared out at the darkening forest. "Blackthorn knows about those choices. He's made it clear that if I interfere with his plans for you, he'll make sure I never work in this territory again." "So you're going to let him destroy my family to protect your job?" The words came out harsher than Rebecca intended, born of fear and desperation. Bear flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Number, I'm going to find another way." "What other way?" "You just said—" "I said Blackthorn has leverage over me. I didn't say I was going to let him use it." Bear turned to face her fully, and Rebecca saw something in his expression that made her heart race. Not with fear, but with hope. "Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." Rebecca waited, her heart pounding as Bear struggled with words that had been locked inside him for too long. "When you knocked on my door that night, you didn't just save your own lives. You saved mine too." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'd been dead inside for 8 years, just going through the motions of living. But you and the children, you brought me back to life." Bear. "I love you," he said simply. "I love Lucy's determination, and Ben's curiosity, and Tommy's laughter. I love the way you make the commissary feel like a home instead of just a place to eat. I love the way you've made my empty cabin feel warm again." He reached out and took her hands in his massive ones. "I love you, Rebecca Morrison, and I'll be damned if I let anyone hurt you or those children." Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks as she looked into the face of the man who had become her anchor, her safe harbor, her heart. I love you too, she whispered. But love doesn't solve this problem. Maybe not by itself, Bear agreed. But love gives us something to fight for. And I intend to fight. Inside the cabin, the children had gone quiet, instinctively sensing the gravity of the conversation taking place on their porch. Outside, the Oregon forest held its breath as two hearts that had found each other in the wilderness prepared to battle for the right to stay together. Bear Sullivan had spent 8 years believing that love was something that could be taken away in an instant, leaving nothing but pain and emptiness behind. But standing on that porch with Rebecca's hands in his and the sound of children's whispered conversations drifting through the windows, he realized that love was also something worth fighting for, something that could make a man find courage he didn't know he possessed. "What are we going to do?" Rebecca asked. Bear squeezed her hands gently, his gray eyes holding a determination that would have made his enemies reconsider their plans if they'd been wise enough to see it. "We're going to remind Marcus Blackthorne that some things are more powerful than money or threats," he said quietly. "We're going to show him what happens when you threaten a family that's finally found its way home." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline light that made the snow-covered mountains look like something from a fairy tale. But there was nothing magical about the tension that had settled over Sullivan's mill, like a heavy blanket. Word had spread among the loggers that their beloved cook might be leaving, and the mood in the commissary was darker than burnt coffee. Rebecca went about her morning routine with mechanical precision, cooking breakfast for 40 men while her mind raced through impossible scenarios. Every option she considered led to the same devastating conclusion. She was trapped between Blackthorne's threats and Harrison's cruel offer, with no escape that didn't involve sacrificing either her family's safety or Bear's livelihood. Bear hadn't appeared for breakfast, which was unusual enough to draw comments from the men. By mid-morning, Rebecca was beginning to worry that something had happened to him. She needn't have concerned herself. Bear Sullivan was very much alive and very busy. He'd started before dawn, visiting every cabin and bunkhouse in the mill complex. By the time most men were finishing their breakfast, Bear had spoken privately with every logger, mill worker, and camp hand in the operation. The conversations were brief, direct, and focused on a simple question: "What do you think of Mrs. Morrison and her children?" The answers were uniformly positive. The men loved Rebecca's cooking, respected her work ethic, and had grown genuinely fond of the children who'd brought life and laughter to their isolated world. More than that, they'd noticed the change in Bear Sullivan, how the grim, solitary foreman had become more approachable, more human, since the Morrison family's arrival. "She's the best thing that's happened to this place in years," said old Pete Crawford, who'd been working lumber camps for 2 decades. "And those kids, hell, Bear, it's been good seeing you smile again." "What are you getting at, Sullivan?" asked Jake Morrison. No relation to Rebecca, but a man who'd taken particular pride in sharing her surname. "Blackthorne wants her gone," Bear said simply. "Claims she owes money to another operation. Plans to send her somewhere she'll be forced into work that no decent woman should have to do." The effect was immediate and gratifying. Jake's face darkened with anger, while Pete spat into the snow with disgust. "That son of a bitch," Jake growled. "Begging your pardon, Bear, but what kind of man would do that to a widow with children?" "The kind who sees people as property instead of human beings," Bear replied. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" By noon, Bear had his answer. The men of Sullivan's Mill had never been particularly political or prone to collective action. They were individualists who valued hard work and minded their own business. But Rebecca Morrison and her children had become their business, part of the rough family that made the isolated mill feel like home. The confrontation began when Marcus Blackthorne emerged from his office to find 40 men standing in the mill yard, their arms crossed and their faces set in expressions of quiet determination. Bear stood at the front of the group, no longer the solitary foreman, but clearly the leader of something larger. "What's the meaning of this, Sullivan?" Blackthorne demanded, his voice sharp with authority. "The men should be working, not standing around." "The men want to talk to you," Bear replied evenly. "About Mrs. Morrison." Blackthorne's pale eyes flicked over the assembled workers, calculating odds and consequences. "This is highly irregular. Employment decisions are not made by committee." "Maybe they should be," said Pete Crawford, stepping forward. especially when those decisions affect the whole operation. Mrs. Morrison's employment is a business matter that doesn't concern the workers, Blackthorne said dismissively. Like hell it doesn't, Jake Morrison called out. She cooks our food, keeps our quarters clean, makes this place livable. That concerns us plenty. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Blackthorne's expression grew darker as he realized that his authority was being challenged not by one man, but by the entire workforce. I'll remind you all that I own this operation, he said coldly. I decide who works here and under what conditions. If you're not satisfied with my decisions, you're free to seek employment elsewhere. Funny thing about that, Bear said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Turns out the men have been talking among themselves. Seems like maybe they're not as satisfied with working conditions here as you thought. What are you saying, Sullivan? I'm saying that 60 men can walk off this job just as easy as one woman can be fired from it. Bear's gray eyes were steady and implacable. Question is, which option makes better business sense? The threat hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire. Blackthorne knew as well as anyone that losing his entire workforce in the middle of winter would be catastrophic. Finding replacements would take months, assuming he could find men willing to work for an owner with a reputation for mistreating his employees. You're talking about blackmail, Blackthorne said, his voice tight with fury. I'm talking about fairness, Bear replied. Mrs. Morrison has done good work here. Her children have been no trouble. The men are satisfied with her cooking and housekeeping. There's no good reason to let her go except to satisfy some outside pressure from your friend Harrison. Business considerations that are none of your concern. They became our concern when you decided to sacrifice a good woman for your own profit. Bear stepped closer to Blackthorne, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the smaller man. Here's what's going to happen. Mrs. Morrison keeps her job. Her children stay here where they're safe and happy, and you tell Harrison that he'll have to find another way to collect his debts. Blackthorne's face had gone pale with rage. And if I refuse? Bear looked back at the assembled men, seeing the same determination in their faces that he felt in his own heart. Then you can explain to your investors why Sullivan's mill shut down in the middle of the most profitable season in years. The silence stretched out like a taut rope, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the pine trees. Blackthorne's eyes darted between Bear and the massive workers behind him, calculating the cost of standing firm against the price of backing down. Finally he spoke, his voice dripping with barely controlled venom. You think you've won something here, Sullivan, but this isn't over. There are other ways to handle problematic employees. Maybe so, Bear agreed, but you'll have to get through all of us to use them. Blackthorne spun on his heel and stalked back toward his office, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. The men began to disperse, returning to their work with the satisfaction of people who'd stood up for what was right and won. But Bear remained in the yard, staring at Blackthorne's office with the uneasy feeling that this victory might prove to be temporary. Men like Blackthorne didn't accept defeat gracefully. They plotted revenge. That evening, Rebecca found Bear on her porch as usual, but his expression was troubled despite the day's success. The men told me what you did, she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. How you got them all to stand up for us. It was their choice, Bear replied. I just asked them what they thought was right. It was more than that, and you know it. Rebecca reached over and took his hand. You risked everything for us. Your job, your reputation, your future. Bear turned to look at her, his gray eyes holding depths of feeling that took her breath away. Rebecca, you and those children are my future. Everything else is just details. Inside the cabin, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the windows. Lucy helping Tommy with his letters, while Ben worked on a carving project Bear had started for him. It was the sound of family, of home, of everything worth fighting for. What happens now? Rebecca asked. Now we stay alert, Bear said grimly. Blackthorne backed down today, but men like him don't forget being humiliated. He'll try something else. Are you afraid? Bear considered the question seriously. For you and the children? Yes. For myself? He shrugged. I spent 8 years being afraid of living. I'm not going to waste any more time being afraid of dying. Rebecca squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Not as two broken people clinging to each other for survival, but as a family bound by love and determination. Outside, the Oregon mountains stood sentinel over the small mill settlement, their snow-covered peaks gleaming in the starlight. Inside the warm cabin, three children who had found safety and love prepared for sleep. While on the porch, two adults who had found each other planned for a future that seemed possible for the first time in years. But in his office, Marcus Blackthorne sat writing letters to men who specialized in solving problems that couldn't be handled through conventional business channels. He had been humiliated today, shown up by his own employees, and made to look weak in front of laborers who should have known their place. That would not stand, not for long. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn, when the mill was quiet and most of the men were still asleep. Rebecca woke to the sound of horses and raised voices, followed by Bear's urgent knock on her door. "Get the children dressed and ready to move," he said without preamble when she opened the door. "Now." Rebecca didn't waste time with questions. She'd learned to trust Bear's instincts completely, and the grim urgency in his voice told her everything she needed to know. Within minutes, she had Lucy, Ben, and Tommy dressed and gathered in the main room, their faces pale but determined. "What's happening?" Lucy asked, her 12-year-old mind already working through possibilities. "Some men came to the mill," Bear explained, checking his rifle while he spoke. "They're looking for your mother. Said they have papers giving them the right to take her back to Harrison's operation." "But the men won't let them," Ben said with the confidence of a 10-year-old who'd seen the mill worker stand up for his family once before. Bear's expression grew darker. "The men would fight for you if they could, but these aren't ordinary debt collectors. They're wearing federal marshal badges and claiming legal authority." Rebecca felt her heart sink. Are they real marshals? Maybe, maybe not, but their badges look official enough to make the workers hesitate. Bear shouldered his rifle and moved toward the door. "Either way, we're not waiting around to find out." "Where are we going?" Rebecca asked, gathering their few valuable possessions into a traveling bag. "Into the mountains. I know places where no one will find us." Bear looked at each of the children in turn, his gray eyes serious but reassuring. "It's going to be cold and hard, but we'll be together. That's what matters." They slipped out the back door of the cabin just as the sun began to edge over the mountain peaks, casting long shadows through the pine trees. Bear led them away from the mill on foot, following paths that weren't visible to untrained eyes. Behind them, they could hear shouting and the sound of doors being kicked open as the searchers discovered their empty cabin. The first day was the hardest. They climbed steadily upward through snow that grew deeper with each mile, following game trails and creek beds that Bear navigated with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains like his own heartbeat. Tommy tired quickly, and Bear carried him for long stretches without complaint. Lucy and Ben pushed themselves beyond what should have been possible for children their age, driven by the understanding that their family's survival depended on keeping up. They made camp that first night in a cave Bear had discovered years earlier during his solitary wanderings. It was small but dry, with a narrow opening that could be easily defended and concealed. Bear built a small fire near the back of the cave, positioning it so the smoke would dissipate through cracks in the rock ceiling rather than drift out the entrance to betray their location. "Are we going to live in the mountains forever?" Tommy asked as they shared a simple meal of bread and dried meat. "Just until it's safe to go back," Rebecca assured him, though she had no idea when that might be. "I like it here," Ben said with surprising enthusiasm. "It's like we're pioneers, just like in the stories." Bear smiled at the boy's resilience. "That's exactly what we are. Pioneers making a new life in the wilderness." Over the following days, they settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible to Rebecca just weeks earlier. Bear taught the children how to move silently through the forest, how to read animal tracks, and how to find water in winter conditions. Lucy proved surprisingly adept at setting snares for small game, while Ben became expert at finding dry wood for their carefully concealed fires. Rebecca discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed. The soft woman who had knocked on Bear's door during a blizzard was gone, replaced by someone harder and more capable. She could butcher a rabbit without flinching, tend a fire through the night, and keep 3 children fed and warm in conditions that would have defeated most people. But it was the evenings that revealed the true strength of what they'd built together. After the day's necessities were handled and the children were settled for sleep, Rebecca and Bear would sit close to their small fire and talk quietly about their hopes for the future. "Do you think they'll give up looking for us?" Rebecca asked one night as snow fell steadily outside their shelter. "Eventually," Bear replied, "but not until spring. Men like Blackthorn don't let go of grudges easily." "What will we do then?" "We can't live in the mountains forever." Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I've been thinking about that. There are places farther north, near the Canadian border, where a man can stake a homestead claim. Good timber country, plenty of game, streams full of fish. You're talking about starting over completely." "I'm talking about starting right." Bear turned to look at her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "No more working for men like Blackthorn. No more looking over our shoulders. Just us, building something that belongs to us." Rebecca considered this vision of the future. A homestead in the wilderness, far from the corruption and cruelty they'd left behind. It would be hard work, harder than anything they'd faced so far, but it would be theirs. "The children would grow up wild," she said softly. "They'd grow up free," Bear countered, "free to become whatever they're meant to be, without anyone telling them their place in the world." That night, as Rebecca lay listening to the steady breathing of her sleeping children and the soft sounds Bear made as he kept watch, she realized that somewhere in the mountains of Oregon, running from men who wanted to destroy their family, she had found something she'd never had before. Not just love, but true partnership. Someone who saw her not as a burden to be managed or a prize to be won, but as an equal partner in the grand adventure of building a life. The test of their partnership came sooner than expected. On their 8th day in the mountains, Bear returned from a scouting trip with news that made Rebecca's blood run cold. "They found our trail," he said grimly. 6 men, maybe 7, following our tracks from yesterday. They'll be here by tomorrow afternoon." Rebecca felt panic rise in her throat. "Can we run again?" "Not with the children. They're tired and the snow's getting deeper. We'd never stay ahead of mounted men." Bear checked his rifle again, his movements calm and methodical. "We're going to have to make a stand here. You can't fight 6 men alone." Bear's smile was grim but determined. "I won't be alone. You know how to shoot, don't you?" Rebecca nodded. James had taught her to handle a rifle during their early years on the frontier, though she'd never had to use the skill in a life-or-death situation. "Good. Then we'll make them pay dearly for what they're trying to do to our family." That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last night together, the children surprised them with their resilience. Lucy helped Bear check their ammunition and plan defensive positions. Ben gathered rocks that could be thrown if they ran out of bullets. Even little Tommy contributed by organizing their medical supplies in case anyone was wounded. "We're not going to let anyone take us away from each other," Lucy declared with fierce determination. "This is our family and we're going to fight for it." Looking at his children, for that's what they had become, his children in every way that mattered, Bear felt his heart swell with pride and love so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," he said simply, "we are." The attack came at midday, just as Bear had predicted. 7 men approached the cave on foot, their horses left behind at the tree line. They moved with the confidence of professionals who'd done this kind of work before, spreading out to surround the cave entrance, while their leader called out in a voice that carried clearly through the thin mountain air. "Morrison, we know you're in there. Come out now and nobody has to get hurt." Bear's answer was a rifle shot that sent the lead man diving for cover behind a boulder. The battle for the Morrison family had begun. For 3 hours, the cave echoed with gunfire as Bear and Rebecca held off attackers who had every advantage except the most important one. They were fighting for money, while the family in the cave was fighting for love. When the shooting finally stopped and the last of the hired guns retreated down the mountain, nursing wounds and admitting defeat, Bear Sullivan stood in the entrance of their cave with his arm around Rebecca Morrison and watched their enemies disappear into the forest. "It's over," he said quietly. "Is it really?" Rebecca asked. Bear nodded, understanding something that had taken him 8 years to learn. Men like that only have power over people who have something to lose. But we've already lost everything we were afraid of losing. Our old lives, our old fear, our old limitations. What we have now, they can't take away. That night, as the family celebrated their victory with the last of their stored food and made plans for their journey to a new life in the north, Bear realized that the lonely woodsman who had opened his door to strangers during a blizzard no longer existed. In his place stood something stronger, a man who belonged to a family and had learned that love wasn't something that could be lost or taken away, but something that grew stronger when it was defended and cherished. Outside their cave, the Oregon mountains stood eternal and unchanging. Inside, four people who had found each other in the wilderness prepared for the next chapter of an adventure that would last the rest of their lives. 25 years later, visitors to the town of New Hope, nestled in the valley below the Canadian border, would often ask about the large house on the hill that overlooked the thriving lumber mill and the neat rows of workers' homes below. Local folks would smile and tell them about the Sullivan family, how Bear and Rebecca had arrived in 1886 with 3 children and a dream of building something that belonged to them. They'd carved their homestead from virgin forest, built their first cabin with their own hands, and slowly expanded into a lumber operation that treated workers like family and put community before profit. Lucy Sullivan had become the town's first school teacher, married a traveling preacher, and raised 6 children who carried their grandparents' values into the next generation. Ben Sullivan had taken over the lumber business, revolutionizing forestry practices with sustainable methods that kept the mountains green for future generations. Tommy Sullivan had become a doctor, bringing modern medicine to frontier communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Sullivan family was how they'd maintained their bond through all the years of growth and change. Every Sunday, 3 generations would gather in the big house on the hill for dinner, filling the rooms with laughter and love that could be heard all the way down in the valley. Bear Sullivan lived to be 73, dying peacefully in the bed he'd shared with Rebecca for 42 years. Rebecca followed him just 6 months later, unable to imagine a world without her partner in the grand adventure of life. They were buried side by side in the little cemetery overlooking the town they'd built, their headstone bearing a simple inscription: "They found each other in the wilderness and built a family that lasted forever." The story of the lonely woodsman who took in a widow and her 3 children became legend throughout the Pacific Northwest, told around campfires and in parlors wherever people gathered to share tales of love triumphing over adversity. But for those who knew them personally, the real miracle wasn't that they'd survived the hardships of frontier life. It was that they'd shown an entire community what was possible when people chose love over fear, family over profit, and hope over despair. Their legacy lived on not just in the town they'd built or the children they'd raised, but in the countless families who found inspiration in their story. Whenever a stranger knocked on a door seeking help, whenever someone chose to stand up for what was right instead of what was profitable, whenever love proved stronger than the forces trying to tear it apart, the spirit of Bear and Rebecca Sullivan lived on. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness: opening a door to strangers, offering shelter from a storm, choosing to see possibility where others see only problems. The Sullivan family proved that heroes aren't born in palaces or trained in academies. They're forged in the wilderness of everyday life by people brave enough to love deeply and fight fiercely for what matters most. What would you do if someone knocked on your door seeking help? Have you ever found family in unexpected places? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Your stories of kindness and family matter here, just like they mattered in that little cabin in the Oregon mountains, where 4 strangers became a family that changed the world. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of love, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that make us human. Because the best stories aren't just about the characters on screen, they're about recognizing the hero in yourself and the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful and lasting.